And now we turn to some very new developments in an old story. Unlike most countries in the world, the U.S. hands out very long prison sentences for nonviolent drug offenses. We imprison a larger share of our residents than Russia, Cuba, Rwanda, and, well, name any country and the comparison stands because we currently imprison more of our residents than any other nation. Since 1990, that number has more than doubled, regardless of the rate of crime. And that's largely because of the war on drugs and mandatory minimum sentences. Many criminal justice experts have called for that to change. So has President Obama and his Attorney General, Eric Holder, and Democrats in Congress. And lately, so have some very independent, very libertarian members of the GOP. Mike Lee has been working with Dick Durbin, and Senators Rand Paul and Cory Booker broached the subject just last month, pledging to make 2014 the year they take on the failed war on drugs. All right. Rand Paul has introduced a bill with Liberal Patrick Leahy to drastically reform mandatory minimums. Paul didn't just make the conservative argument here either, that these harsh drug laws are expensive and ineffective. He also said they discriminated against the poor and minorities. You may recall Lawrence O'Donnell flagged that recently.
You just heard a Republican senator quoting an ACLU report on how the war on drugs visits disproportional suffering on black men. An ACLU report. You just heard a Republican senator say, quote, "There is no justice here."
And as Lawrence was getting at, Paul wasn't only right to join this reform effort, he was politically independent. The war on drugs may be a policy failure, but it's been a political winner for many, many candidates in both parties. From Nixon's law and order crackdown in 1968 to George H.W. Bush's campaign crime obsession in 1988, running on mass incarceration was often a winning message.
I pledge to you, the wave of crime is not going to be the wave of the future in America.
As Governor, Michael Dukakis vetoed mandatory sentences for drug dealers. He vetoed the death penalty. His revolving door prison policy gave weekend furloughs to first-degree murderers not eligible for parole. Now Michael Dukakis says he wants to do for America what he's done for Massachusetts. America can't afford that risk.
Now that's politically interesting. There's nothing easy or automatic about the Obama administration or Congress stepping up here. And I'm not just talking about speeches or press releases to you tonight. In the biggest story you might not have heard about today, the Senate Judiciary Committee took up a key bill to reform these very mandatory minimums, sponsored by Libertarian Republican Mike Lee and Democratic Whip Dick Durbin. They debated it and marked it up. The amendment that would process would clear for a House floor or Senate floor vote. The bill would cut some drug-related mandatory minimums in half and apply recent reductions in crack penalties to people who are serving time on old charges. The ACLU calls this the most significant piece of criminal justice reform to make it to the Senate floor in several years. And for the first time last week, Attorney General Eric Holder also endorsed this bill, which we discussed in our interview last week. And when the markup was done today, the Senate Judiciary Committee passed this bill, not by a party line vote, not by a narrow vote, by a vote of 13-5. And Republican Mike Lee, to his credit, was out there working with Mr. Holder at a hearing just yesterday on this issue.
Thank you, General Holder, for joining us today. I appreciate the support you expressed earlier for the Smarter Sentencing Act. I've appreciated the opportunity to work with Senator Durbin on that and welcome the support of my colleagues as we try to move forward in a way that makes our law enforcement efforts more effective.
And when I interviewed the Attorney General last Thursday, he also addressed the reality of how these sentencing laws operate.
This mass incarceration happens with a cost. If you look at the way it impacts certain communities, and let's be honest about this, communities of color, where young men who should be the future of these communities are taken out, labeled, then have inabilities to obtain good employment, to be the kinds of productive citizens that they might be. Now, people have to be held accountable for individual decisions that they make. But we need to have proportionate penalties.
That's important. The disproportionate impact of these laws adds injustice to inefficiency. We know that. We can see that. In fact, government data shows African Americans are the least likely to receive relief from these mandatory minimum sentences. And while many Washington politicians are locked in battles that require pretending they don't see the same things or see the same America, this is actually an area where the moral imperative and the politics are connecting. I believe that. And in that spirit, to echo President Obama's Attorney General tonight, we give the last word to Senator Paul.
If I told you that 1 out of 3 African-American males is forbidden by law from voting, you might think I was talking about Jim Crow 50 years ago. Yet today, 1/3 of African-American males are still prevented from voting because of the war on drugs.